the first step is like, can you just like build something quality at all, right? Like, that's step one. Then I would say step two, which like, again, these kind of start conflicting with each other, is like, can you build something quality and can you build it quickly? And then I would say like the third tier is like, could you build something quality and build it quickly? And does it delight your customer? The absolute last thing that I want Brevity to feel like is for it to be like a chore or to feel like
Mm.
just like a tool you use in your job. But like I want using Brevity to feel like almost like a game, like you like love coming back to, and it's like, a fun experience.
Today I'm speaking with Ryley Randall, the founder and CEO of Brevity. If you missed the introduction to this interview, you can click here to watch it. And if you're enjoying these conversations, make sure to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. You're listening to User Stories, episode number 9 with Ryley Randall. Okay, Ryley, thanks for coming on. Let's start with the most difficult question. It's
Yep.
2022. There are a
Mhm.
ton of no-code app builders on the market. What makes Brevity different?
Yeah, it's a good question. You are right. It's difficult, but it's also probably the most frequently asked question I get. Um, and I would say fundamentally, what makes Brevity different is, you could call it. It might seem small in my answer, but I think it plays out in a lot of interesting ways. Which is, um, typically in the no-code world, the conversation centers around trade-offs. And there is, and I would say, in a lot of ways, one of the biggest trade-offs right now, people bring up quite a bit, depending on the platforms you use, is like performance. And so I'm just using performance as an example, but we want to sort of flip that on its head and say, yeah, the big trade-off between using Brevity versus, code is performance, and you get better performance if you use Brevity, and you'll get worse performance if you use code. But that's the trade-off you're making. Um, so, my background was I ran a no-code agency for several years, and that's how I gained so much experience using all these different no-code tools. And honestly, I just didn't feel like there was a no-code platform that fit our needs as a very advanced agency trying to build real apps for our clients that were being used by tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of users, and enabled us to like have full confidence that we can just build our prototype or like a very very basic MVP, but that we could have full confidence taking on big clients and being able to say like, yep, 100% we can deliver, and you'll be amazed at the output that we provide you.
Okay, so I just want to go back to what you said there about trade-offs. What I think I hear
Yeah.
you saying is that what you're really trying to do at Brevity is, and I agree with you that a lot of conversation, I don't even think just in no code, but just in development in general, is about
Yep.
focuses
Yep.
on trade-offs. And what you're trying to do in particular, you talked about the trade-off that most people think of in terms of no code when it comes to performance. So if I use a no code platform, maybe I won't have as
Yep.
good performance as something built with code, and that's what you're trying to focus on with Brevity, is just eliminating that idea so that there is no trade-off, that be able to build something as powerful, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the way that people make apps, like, yeah, there's lots of new technologies, there's new frameworks, there's new libraries, but like fundamentally, the idea hasn't been very different in, you know, centrally software's been around, which is that like I learned this crazy syntax on how to like, which we call programming language. I can type that into some text box or some code editor. And then, that actually gets compiled in my program, especially in like, uh, web programming. A lot has advanced, but like the fundamental experience and the way we go about it hasn't changed that much. And so, uh, like two, I would say like things we care about a lot, like, or call them theories that we have on like why we're going to be successful. Um, so the first is, I would say, is general to most no code, which is just the idea that like the concepts of being a programmer aren't the complicated part. The most complicated part is having to learn the syntax, the code part. And that if we can build amazing interfaces for people to learn the programming concepts without having to learn all of the wacky syntax and like getting environments set up, and there's all this other stuff to like that goes beyond running this code or running whatever program or software you built, then people actually can become much more productive faster because you remove this huge barrier to having to learn to actually make something real. Um, and then the second piece is that like, okay, we need to go to code at some point, right? Because that's, like that's how much of the tooling, it's expecting code. So that's part of Brevity's, secret as well. It's like every drag and drop that happens in our platform, and you click deploy, we're actually writing lines of code for you behind the scenes. But we can do things that a engineer wouldn't do. So depending on how you use a container or how you're fetching data or how you're, like where your inputs are on a page, we'll actually change the way that the code is formatted to make sure it's as performant as possible. And so while a engineer technically could do that, they're most likely not going to, because it's like, yeah, I'd get slightly more performance by rewriting this whole thing, but in this one case, it's not going to make a huge difference, so they don't do it. But over across an entire app, all of those things add up, and you can actually start seeing some pretty big performance gains. But because we built the technology to write the code, our compiler doesn't care about having to rewrite the entire app. It'll do it. And so we're able to produce better code than what an engineer most likely would write for you. Right. So, and we try to show that time and time again. And that, we show that with our customers. If you were to go hire, so if you're a solo, say you're a non-technical founder and you had some idea for an app and you wanted to hire someone to build it for you, the app that you would build in Brevity not only could do with no code, but it would be more performant and it would be better written than most likely than if you were to go hire some engineer to write it for you. Just because there's optimizations and things that we can bake in that just would never make sense for a human engineer or a human coder to do.
Yeah, I'm curious to learn more about that. And to dive into the details there, and also to learn about like just your philosophy, I guess, in terms of building product. I played around with Brevity last night, as you know. Yeah. I built myself a little to-do app, and I'm sure that, I know I have much more to do before I fully understand the product, but I want to get into some of the technical stuff that you're doing. And like I said, your philosophy of product, but take me back first to the early days and what kind of motivated you to say, screw it, I'm going to tackle this massive problem and spend a bunch of time and money doing it. You said that you were working at a no-code agency. Do you have a background writing like in programming, or like, I guess take me back to the early days when this idea first came about.
Yeah. So, I am a developer, but not by like profession. I'm actually much more interested in like, the business side of running things. But I've always just felt like technology was increasingly becoming a language of business, right? Like I had all these ideas I wanted to do, and I felt like, to execute on all of them, they all involve some technology somehow. And so, right, like I got my degree in finance because I thought about it in the same way, like how people talk about businesses, they talk about cash flows and rates and it's just like a way that people describe how a business functions and operates. And so I felt like technology was increasingly becoming, one of those languages of how we describe how a business operates. So I actually initially started, learning to, I started learning to code not from I just wanted to know enough to, peek behind the curtain, so to speak, just to sort of see how the sausage is made and like know enough to speak the lingo and like understand what people are telling me, but not necessarily because I was like, oh, I'm going to go be a software engineer. Um, and so along that path is where I started,
And
I
sorry to
had all these,
interrupt you.
yeah,
What were you
go ahead.
learning there in particular? Like what languages? What were you dabbling in?
Yeah. So, I started out learning some Python, just like doing some more, I guess you'd say more like data sciencey stuff.
Hmm.
And then I had someone tell me that like, just learn JavaScript. It's the future. And I think in many ways they were right. Like obviously there's a lot of room for other languages, but so then I just said, okay, cool. I'll just focus solely on JavaScript, which is, that's how, you know, that's the language of the web. It's the language of a lot of backends now. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in JavaScript. So I'm glad that's where I spent a lot of my early time. So yeah, so I just started, like I literally just did a little I just did like free coding classes on the internet. And I think I technically bought like a one time bought like a $15 Udemy course that I never actually finished. But that was the extent of my training for the first part. But I had these, but I'm not very good. Well, I wasn't, and but I had these ideas, and so I started coming across all of these tools. And honestly, at the time, like I don't even think they used the word no code. But like I came across all these tools. It was like, okay, cool. I want to build this feature. I can actually not build that. I can just like send some API requests to like this thing. Zapier was around then. Like, oh, I can send this to Zapier. It can do its thing, or I can like send this over to some Google Sheet and do something there. Like I would, I started to discover all of these useful tools that I would just try to use to piece together the different products that I was wanting to build, just for like random business ideas, things I wanted to explore. And yeah, so one thing led to another. I think like around that time, the term no code started becoming more popular. And yeah, I ended up running a no code agency for a few years. So
Okay, so similar to you, I dabbled in and still dabble in learning how to code. Um,
yeah,
and I mean, I've my whole path I started on Bubble back in 2018, and had no prior experience really to that. I'd taken like one Ruby on Rails course like 6 years earlier for a couple weeks,
yeah,
but dropped it. Found Bubble, fell in love with it, fell in love with the whole no code movement, and that kind of was my gateway drug to code, to learning
yeah,
how. And unless you're being just like super humble right now, um, you know, I I can do a little bit, like my story sounds similar. I would probably describe it in a similar way in terms of like I dabbled with all of these tools and languages, and I know a little bit right now, but
yeah,
I could never take my current skills and build a no code platform that would allow other people to build apps without code. So, do you have a co-founder? Did you like secretly are you just being humble? Like I guess like you're the CEO and founder, but do you have someone who's
yeah,
handling the technical side of things and writing all of the code for you? And how involved are you in the technical side of the app?
yeah. So we have hired engineers and we have brought in CTO, which like they're really really talented. But um, yeah, I mean the whole first version of Brevity I wrote myself, and
Wow.
in fact the beta editor, which is the editor you were using, like that's still probably 85% all code that I wrote. Um,
So how did you do
so
that? How did you like it's written in React if
yeah,
I'm is
yeah,
that right?
yeah. So yeah, so I was there's yeah so the next stage really just like in my journey is that uh, so I started this no code agency and we started getting bigger, taking on bigger clients, and more and like as we got bigger and as we started trying to go after clients that would be willing to pay us a lot more money, the requirements started becoming more intense, and we started really pressing the limits of what these different no code platforms could do. And so the end result is it ended up, the products that we'd actually deliver to our customers ended up being these like Frankenstein together pieces of like this part's built in this platform, this part's built in this platform. And then we would like have to, virtually every app we built required some kind of custom plugin or something. And so really it was like, like I just learned by just like out of necessity, right? Like I just had this idea in my head that like I would just say yes to the opportunity, and then I felt like I could figure out how to do it. And so I would say yes to being able to do some feature, and then we'd realize like crap, this platform doesn't let us do that. So like I'm gonna go figure out how to write this piece of code and integrate it into some plugin. And if you like do that enough times, and stay up all night staring at something enough days in a row, you eventually start realizing like, oh, okay, I'm starting to see some patterns here. Um, and then so that really was like how I learned and how I developed. It was just like I spent enough time. Like that's really what I did. Like I can remember just staring at these like code snippets and Stack Overflow for hours and hours, being like, I don't know what's going on here, but if I just like stare long enough and like try enough iterations on like me trying to copy it, like maybe I'll figure out how it works. And then eventually I did. So
What no code platform were you primarily building on when you had your no code agency?
yeah, so we used the front end. We used uh, Adalo, Glide, Bubble, tons of stuff on Bubble, Integromat, now Make. Right, like I really did. It gave me a great. Uh, Obviously, we built a lot of sites in Webflow as well. Like uh, it gave me like a great education on how these, uh, just on how these different interface works, right? And how
Hmm.
all these different platforms decided to take these technical concepts. And I guess part of this too, going back to what I said, like, this idea that like the programming concepts are easier to learn when you remove the syntax of coding away. And I felt that a lot. Like I felt like I would learn these concepts using like Bubble or something, like on how to set up a database and like these workflows. And then, I'd start having to write something as a plugin, and all of a sudden it would click like, oh, like this concept is so easy, I understand it. What's hard for me was to remember like where this curly brace went. And then once eventually you get good enough for language, you don't even think about it anymore. But that was I just like never really escaped that feeling that like how many times did I understand this concept conceptually, and it was so easy for me to figure out in one of these visual interfaces, but getting the being able to like convert what was like I knew how the logic should work in my head, but like how do I actually convert that into JavaScript? Uh, was like the biggest blocker for a long time. So
Okay, so you're building all of these different no code apps on these different
yep,
platforms that exist,
yep,
and you're learning through doing that, not only how these different companies have chosen to approach this problem of how do I put a visual an interface that build an interface that allows people to write code and write code for them, and you're getting these you're understanding how all of these platforms are approaching that problem. Simultaneously, you're having to, because clients are coming to you with more and more complicated problems, you find yourself having to kind of build plugins on top of these platforms that allow you to solve problems that these platforms haven't yet addressed. At what
yep.
point do you have this aha moment, or this at what point does this flip switch in your head where you say, I want to build my own platform, I want to approach this problem in a different way?
Yeah. Uh, I feel like I never wanted to actually build my own platform. And still, honestly, like, there's lots of days where I'm like, what am I doing? Why am I trying to tackle this? Because, yeah, I mean, it is such a tricky problem. Like, it's just tough, right? Like, it's a very difficult product to build. Um, and I just, yeah, like, so I feel like I feel like I had ideas for years of like, well, this product, this is how this product should be different. They should be building this in, like I felt like I had been building this bank of ideas on how a no code platform should be built, but I always felt like someone else would see the vision I had. Like there's enough no code people in the world. There's enough well funded companies. Like either the existing players will figure it out and they'll iterate and they'll improve, um, or someone else, will come on the scene and they'll be like, well funded and they'll figure it out. And I can't wait for that. Like, I can't wait to use that. And so like, browse Product Hunt every day, waiting for a new no-code platform to come out. And yeah, and what felt like years of no one, like this, like there's no one seeing like the way felt like a platform should be built, and like seeming like these platforms weren't iterating in the way or providing the support that I wished a no-code platform would support. Yeah, I decided like if no one's gonna do it, then I like have to, because I just feel like I generally do feel so strongly about like no code as being the future, and just the number of doors that it's going to unlock for people all over the world. Um, but like it just felt like I couldn't not do it after waiting so long. So
And what year are you starting to have these thoughts?
uh, yeah, it's a good question. So I probably started using what we call, like the different no-code platforms in 2016, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I was pretty in the thick of like our agency in 2018, 2019. Um, and keep in mind, like I was a lot of those years I was in college, so I graduated in 2020. And so I actually, I like running the agency. It was awesome. I was gonna go. I like had a job offer lined up, um, and I was, like all set to go. COVID happened, and my like start date to go start at this job had been pushed back a little bit, and so I kind of was left with this like little gap where uh, I was like, I always had wanted to have this like idea of how a no code platform should be built. Like I had like a few assumptions that I was like, if I could prove that these were true, like the way a no code, like technically how a no code platform could work behind the scenes, uh, then I think there'd be something here. So I honestly, I just like, I ended up having like a month and a half with a lot of free time. And so I hacked away on this thing enough. And fortunately I was able to make a big enough progress that I felt like it was worth taking the risk. So I called the company that I was going to go work for and said, not actually going to come anymore. So sorry. And yeah, that
That's
was it.
amazing.
I've been working on Brevity ever since. Yeah.
That's such an incredible story. This question will take us a little bit, I think, into your philosophy around product design,
Hmm.
and some of the decisions you made to set up Brevity the way that you did. But when you were building that first prototype, let's say,
Yeah.
if you had to pin it down to like one or two core things that this first version of the product needed to have that these other no code tools were lacking in, what would you say those one or two things were for you? And that can be like a particular feature. It can be more abstract, however you want to approach that question.
Yeah. So, uh, yeah, so I mean, my high level approach to like product design is like I'm sure there are people smarter than me and there are better ways to do it. But like the way that makes sense in my head is just like it's almost like following the scientific method. Like I pick an assumption, I like I try to put a process in place that allows me to like create a hypothesis, test it as fast as I can, and then based off the results, either say great that works, and if not, then like reiterate again. And so like a lot of my thought process on building a product revolves around like how many cycles can I go through of just like trying to iterate and learn and learn and learn as fast as I can. And like, let's assume that this is assume that every decision I make, like everything I'm trying to solve takes 20 iterations. Maybe it takes five, but maybe some take longer. So like there's a lot of iterations you have to go through, and you don't know, right? You have ideas, you have assumptions, you have like things. Definitely times you have to trust your gut, but um, so yeah, the very, very first thing that I wanted to prove was that I wanted to give someone a no code app. I wanted to give someone an app built on Brevity, and I wanted them to not be able to tell that it was built on Brevity. Like, would they be able, like, with like I wanted them to look at it and assume someone wrote this in at the time React. Like that was sort of the
What was the
goal.
benchmark for that app? Because when you say app, obviously an app can be many different things, right? What kind of app? would pass that threshold to prove that assumption for you?
Yeah, it was less. I mean, at the time, I was just building to do apps all day, right?
Yeah.
Like basic, like CRUD functionality. But it was less about, so my older brother, who actually I was fortunate to recruit to come work for Brevity, but at the time, he was, um, he's a talented engineer, and so my goal was to hand him like the code for an application, and have him not be able to tell that, like, oh, this was written in Brevity, and instead, like, assume that I had wrote it by hand. If that makes
That's
sense.
interesting. Now, why that in particular? Because you could, like, when you first started answering that question,
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about the finished product, but I think what you were talking about is the actual code that Brevity would produce
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
um, in that visual builder when you put stuff on the screen, the code
Yeah.
that it spits out. So
Yeah.
why optimize for that? Why was that important to you?
Uh, because there, like, again, it goes back to this idea that, like, okay, so when we were running our agency, like, one of the things that frustrated me more than anything was, it was two things. Is one is we'd spend, we would spend tons of time optimizing design. We'd work with, the founders of these different platforms to, like, try to optimize how we can maximize the performance of whatever platform we were using. And then we'd, like, go hand it over to a product client, and they'd use it and be like, oh yeah, this looks good, but, like, why is it so slow? Or, like, what's this loader bar doing here? Or, like, like, why does that take so long? And we were kind of stuck with just like, well, because of, we built it so fast and we're using this platform, and, we talked about the trade-offs, whatever. And then the second thing was this idea of, like, a client would give us a feature set, we'd start building the product, and then they'd come to us 3 weeks in and they'd say, like, hey, actually, like, we actually had a different idea for a feature, like, hey, can we do this instead? And we'd be like, crap, like, we can't build now that you've changed, like, this feature, and even though in your mind it seems slight, like a small, it actually, like, changes a ton on our side, and now we, like, the platform that we chose to build can't really do that, so we either got to, like, rebuild the whole thing in some other platform, or find a way to, like, extend it with some plugin, which can be expensive, or, like, even sometimes, like, convince you that, like, that feature doesn't make sense right now. And so, like, you get in these weird positions where, like, as in, I'm like, you're trying to pay me to build a feature, and I'm trying to tell you, like, no, don't pay me to build that feature, because, like, we can't do it right now because of whatever platform we chose. And I just felt like, and again, it goes back to this idea of, like, trade-offs, right? They're like, oh, no code. And so it's kind of this idea that, like, well, if the no code platform just wrote code, then there would be no trade-offs, right? Like, if what this thing actually built was the exact code an engineer would write, and then it went through the exact same process that an engineer would go through to, like, deploy it, and it was using, all of that same infrastructure, then, there's no more trade-off anymore, right? Like, it's just the same as what an engineer wrote. So
This kind of ties back into what you said, I think, in response to my first question about what separates Brevity, and it's interesting to hear you talk about that particular piece of the puzzle, like getting your program to write code in a way that the best engineers would write it. When you first said that in the beginning of this interview, I thought to myself, if there are, I mean, most of my audience is, like, bubble builders and no code builders. But if there is anyone who's listening to this or watching this who can code in React, they might, like, jump out at that and be like, how the hell do you know that the code that your program is producing is the best possible code that could be produced? And so I guess, how do you know? Because there's the one thing that I've learned about Bubble, no code, and even more so with code, is that there are a number of different ways to solve a particular problem with code, right? Every developer is different in terms of how they would approach it. There are, of course, best practices, but I think it's you can solve a problem in a number of different ways. So I guess how have you come to the conclusion that the way that Brevity is writing code is the way that an elite React developer would produce that same code or solve that same problem?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. So I'd say it's a function of two things, which the second one's maybe more important. I'll share the first one. And the first is that uh, you are right. It can be very subjective, right? Like, who's to say that like this is the right way to do something? And I totally get that. And we definitely have opinions, and those opinions are formed by the elite programmers that we've hired at Brevity to come work on Brevity. And so, like these opinions are coming, these opinions are being formed from really talented engineers who have spent their whole careers thinking about like what is the best way to build a web app. So that's sort of where we start. But then the second thing is that no metric is perfect, but I think in general there are a lot of metrics that can provide a picture to if a app is performant or not. Like a very common one is like the lighthouse score,
Mm-hmm.
right? Built right in a Chrome browser, you can test the score of a website. So every time an app gets deployed in Brevity, we run a lighthouse score on it. And we don't even surface it right now. We just send it internally to make sure that things are, that these apps are being fast. And we've had to iterate a lot. And so, like it sounds dumb, but like we've probably rewritten our button component 3 or 4 times. It seems small, it's a button, but there's things like, oh, well, actually, like we need to make it so it's a little bit more flexible this way. Even stuff like there's all kinds of best practices in the web, just in terms of like making sure things are accessible and, don't have too much bloat in them. And so, we make sure that, every button that on our page has all of the right ARIA attributes and then so I'd say the other thing tying into that is like we just know our compiler is very smart and we know so much about an application, right? Like we know, an application, modern apps are driven by state. Like we know, okay, everywhere that state can change on this page. And we know exactly every block that's going to be referencing which state. And so we can fine tune things in a way that would be very, very hard for a human to do. Not saying that they can't do it, right? Like, and there's varying degrees of like it's definitely I think a law of diminishing returns, right? Like it reaches a certain point that like your app's probably performant enough, and like the little ounce, little pieces of performance that like we can squeeze out, like probably aren't going to make a huge difference for your users. But performance and reliability tend to be pretty hand in hand, so like so like related to performance is the fact that when you deploy an app on Brevity, it gets deployed to over 270 regions around the world. So like not only is it fast, but like there's, if one of those goes down, like there's hundreds more that this app can be served from. And so like, we virtually almost have 100% uptime, and like your app being deployed gets deployed on its own isolated infrastructure with 100% uptime. So there's a lot of benefits there beyond just, you maybe consider more reliability than beyond just performance. But I kind of veered off from your question.
No. But I think underscored in what you said there too, and I think really this is like the only possible answer to that question, is that what I hear you saying is it's a moving target too, and it's like it's dynamic and always changing in terms of what kind of code you're producing. And it's not like you figured out this magical formula that just works forever. It's like it's something that you constantly have to revisit as technology evolves, and it evolves very fast. So you're revisiting it all the time, I imagine. It's not surprising to hear you say that you've had to change your button component a number of times already. But okay, so let's go back to, you said that first assumption that you were trying to test was, can I write a program that will allow me to drag visual components onto a page, produce code that an engineer would write? You solve that problem, let's say, or you satisfy, you figure out that yes, I can. What is the other major assumption that you had to test after that in those early days?
Yeah. I would say the other assumption I had to test after that was just, I mean, it this isn't really one assumption, but the idea was that like, okay, if we can figure out at least, satisfy enough this idea that okay, yeah, we can build we like since that first prototype where we sort of solved it, right? Like we've had to iterate a ton and there's lots of improvements that we've had to make, but we had a good idea of like how those improvements would play out and the things that we could do. Um, so the next piece was okay, can we build a visual interface that is meaningfully better and more enjoyable to use uh, than you could say other no code platforms, but just that like just in general that like how long like can we build an interface that allows someone to come in and quickly learn and start building whatever idea they have in their head. And so I would say, for the past few months, that's been like our core focus. And it's tricky because there's thousands of these questions, right? Like all day we're having these conversations of like, okay, here's the technical concept and like how an engineer would think about it. But, technically like there's some weird ways that this was engineered, 20 years ago. So like, do we want to, you know, do we call it, what do we, and like, naming too is like always, we always have these big debates around, like, do we name it the technical thing so that if someone Googles it, there's like some concepts there they understand, but like maybe the new name's not very intuitive. So do we name it our own thing? And then we make sure we educate people on our side on like what this thing is. And do we try to like abstract away some of the weird complexity that, some area of software development has, or do we like, no, let's just try to explain to people why it's complex and like, give them all the functionality there. Um, and so if I had to codify it into one sentence, it was like another key assumption was that I felt like a lot of no code platforms. I'll use the analogy of like, imagine the difference between like Photoshop and the like some photo editing app on your iPhone, right? It's like that analogy there. And there's like a spectrum there. I felt like most no code platforms planted themselves closer to the photo editing app on their iPhone. Or like a lot of platforms like, oh, you got to build some like app for your son's soccer team, or you wanted to like, put some blog together, or like, like sit really easily put some app together for some conference. And then obviously there's a spectrum, right? Like Bubble's probably closer to like the Photoshop in terms of what you could do. But I felt pretty strongly that I wanted Brevity to be Photoshop. Like I wanted it to be in terms of like what you could build on the platform and what you could do. I wanted Brevity to be very, very powerful and for people to feel like there's no limits to what I can do here. And so, but obviously that's tricky, right? Like there's a lot of really tricky interfaces, and there's a reason that a lot of these no-code platforms like make it very simple. And so that was sort of the next idea is like, can we even like build interfaces that people can use that like allow all this customizability and, like, but it's still an enjoyable experience and it doesn't, take 2 years to learn.
Yeah, yeah. I think that like, I mean, the second part of, or what you just said there, really, the tricky part is like you're building a programming language essentially. I mean, like I remember I was
Yeah.
listening to some podcast a while ago, and it was, I forget, it was with some guy. It was the Lex Friedman podcast. I forget who he was speaking to, but it was with some guy who had invented some programming language, or at least had a lot of experience like building programming
Yeah.
languages from the ground up. And he was talking about like designing a programming language and speaking about it in terms of like user interface design. And I had never thought about a programming language as just really another user interface. Um,
Yep.
it's the interface between the coder and the machine at that point, right? And I think what you're doing is similar in the sense that it's just like infinitely complex. It's like, how do I allow people to create whatever they want? And there,
Yeah.
like you said in your answer, there's no end to the different directions that you could go in when it comes to trying to solve that problem. And as you were talking about naming in particular, one of my questions for you was like, who is Brevity trying to target? And I think naming really kind of taps into that problem where it's like, who are your core users? I tried out Brevity yesterday. I built a to-do app. The interface felt very familiar to me in a way that I think other no-code platforms that I've tried aside from Bubble have not, in the sense that I got in there and it felt very simple. I saw a lot of similarities in terms of how you approach certain things to how Bubble does. And I can definitely like see the influence there. And it's not surprising to hear that like you spent some time working on Bubble. But like, I guess so it felt simple for me, but I imagine, someone who has no experience with no code would be like, well, I don't understand any of this stuff. So like, who is that person that you have in mind as you build your product for your user?
Yeah. Initially truthfully, we're building Brevity for agencies to use. Not because that's who we're going to build forever, but I guess it's more of who we have been building it for, that I would say, these agencies. In large part because
you were scratching your own itch, it seems, right?
Yeah. Well, like
exactly.
that's where I came from. But even from a user perspective, right? Like even right now, we're not really at a like trying to drive a whole bunch of revenue. We're not really running after growth. Like what we really care about is like bringing users onto our platform who we can be like amazing design partners with us, right? And I'm provide us really good feedback. And it seems like agencies just fit that bill better than, we do have just like co-founders who've come and built their product on Brevity. So it's not like it excludes them by any means. But when it came to like, okay, who is the first group of people we want on the platform? An agency who's building 10 different app ideas and has all these different use cases is a much better user for us to sort of partner with at this stage than someone who is trying to build a single idea and, it's tough to get a product off the ground. So like, they may work on it for 6 months and then realize it didn't work out. And so, they're no longer to be using our platform. So, for us, we've sort of been focused on this sort of agency user, but I think that'll rapidly change pretty quickly, and I probably should have started with some context here. So the editor, this might help inform some of your questions as well. The editor you're using is like our beta editor, right? And it's sort of our playground to experiment with all these different interfaces and signs, and we're pretty controlled on who we let in there. And a few months ago, it's been great because we've been able to learn a ton, right? We've learned so much about like, how should you style components? How should you build workflows? How should they integrate with your database, right? Like all of these things. And so a few months ago, we started rewriting our entire tech stack from scratch, and basically like taking all of these things that we've learned and rebuilding it from the ground up to, every improvement that we've learned over the past year and a half, all of the best performance improvements, like you name it, we're building into the new one. And so that'll be, that will come out in the next, we're hoping in the next 6 weeks, but it may be first of the year, something like that. But, so
yeah, I did see that. I joined your Slack community and I saw that in the announcement section that the announcement that you made, that you are in the process of rebuilding it. And I want to come back to that because I'm curious to know what led to that, if you had always kind of planned to do that, where that fit into the roadmap. But what I'm curious to know first, are these no-code agencies that are your users that you're talking to mostly? What if you had to kind of, again, put it into like maybe 1 or 2 or 3 main pieces of feedback that you've gotten from them, what seems to be some general feedback that you've received from these agencies in particular?
Yeah. So I would say that they're all kind of interrelated, but it helps to speak to like some specific features we're implementing on that feedback. Um, so probably the biggest one is with the no code agencies that have come on in particular is like what are the resources that Brevity can provide after a product goes live, right? So like a lot of no code platforms, the workflow fits really well when you haven't really deployed your product. But after you've deployed, that's where things actually kind of get trickier. Like, okay, well, how do I actually like deploy my product without breaking anything? How can I like hot fix bugs? Like what happens when I've, you know, my app's deployed. I started working on a new feature. Someone just requested that like, hey, I need to fix this bug. So do I like have to quickly finish this feature before that bug can go out? How do I, like, and then even just like, business side, like how do I, can I, like what, how do I bring analytics in here? What can you tell me about my application? Like, are there optimizations you'd bake in? So, like this new editor will have a whole suite of, tools to help after an app's deployed, like not just to like build your idea and launch it, but like actually turn that launched product and our idea into a successful company, and to like really manage that workflow better. I would say another one is, the idea of being able to like more robustly, like build out a design system and use components. And so, right, like our we kind of have a little bit of this in the beta editor, but it'll be sort of fully formed out. The new one of, like as an agency or an organization, you'll be able to fully build out like a full suite of components that are including a whole design system. And then as you're building, you can, these blocks will show up just like Brevity blocks that you can drag in and customize. And, it makes it really, really nice and easy for agencies who, have spent time building out this sort of design language that they often build a lot of projects in, to sort of have that be natively supported in Brevity's platform.
Yeah, man, it's so fascinating to think about what you're doing. As you were speaking there, I was thinking, like, even getting that feedback and building with those people in mind, you're optimizing for certain things that and sacrificing some things that you might otherwise spend time on. Like I imagine that, this next version of your product is going to have like version control systems for agencies that might be much more developed than other parts of the platform that you might have spent more time on had you been optimizing for another user. Like your product would probably look totally different if you were speaking with like first time startup founders who really don't have like any sort of technical background prior to coming into Brevity.
Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. There definitely are trade-offs there. And there are things that we, that we think about that, yeah, we want to get to, but realistically, it's like, yeah, we have to make priorities. And so I'll give you a good idea. Like one thing that we've known we really wanted to support for a while is we feel like, so it won't be in our new editor initially, but, we want to build out. We feel like the data tab of our of Brevity, right? Like where you go to like see your app's data, like that could be so much more than just like a table showing your data, right? Like it should be the admin panel, excuse me, of your app where you actually can go and like, if I want to, like create unique views where like, all my things come in where, maybe my app is has products and I want to create a view that's cards of my products and I can like click on them and easily set up workflows to manage them. Or, maybe I want to like, you should be able to design a marketing email in Brevity and send it to all your users from this like admin panel. Like that's a tool that, like founders who have been using Brevity have asked for. And so you're right. Like that's something that, yeah, if that was our target, then we would be going for. that right now we're not gonna ship right away. But I do think by experience, and the concept of like someone who has no technical experience trying to build an idea, uh, like one is like I said, I do think we have lots of ideas for how we can help bring those people into Brevity, and we have some pretty good ideas on sort of different ways to think about the template idea on like and making it much easier for someone who's not technical to come in and start building things. Um, but it's been our experience, like when we've worked with founders who are non-technical and then you know started trying to build their app, they tend to ramp much quicker than they thought. And so the challenge is that they come in and initially are like, why is this so difficult? Like, this other platform I could like, just like click a couple buttons and like, I had this app here. But then once they were like, a couple weeks in and yeah, there was some pain that we want to solve, we started getting feedback like, it's amazing how many options you give us here. Like I wouldn't change a thing because we actually needed this feature and we could do it, and we needed this feature and we could do it, and like uh, and so we definitely have a lot we need to do to help people become like get over that hump and ramp better and have this like smooth transition where they can get really sophisticated. But um, it's been our experience that founders who do come on who aren't technical, like by the time they're clicking deploy to like send their app out into the world and like get users on, they have now become like fairly sophisticated builders who appreciate having more functionality. So
Yeah, I think like most of the time that happens too without people realizing it for the reasons you kind of mentioned earlier, where it's like a lot of these
yeah,
concepts. I think you're absolutely right when you're like the syntax kind of makes things more complicated sometimes than it needs to be. A lot of the concepts, like even learning like what a conditional is, or
yeah,
like relational databases, once it clicks for you, it's like, oh, that makes total sense, and it's actually not that tricky. It's actually like similar to stuff that I kind of already knew coming into
yeah,
this. And then I agree, like once those first few aha moments happen and things start to click and you start building out more complex features that require more flexibility, that's what, like, I think that happens really quickly. I've seen that too. I've experienced it myself, and I see it with a lot of people who are like first getting into no code and really kind of falling down the rabbit hole. So on that note too, I'm curious to know, like, there were a few things as I was going through Brevity last night where I was thinking, I wonder, and I know that you guys are still in beta and
yeah.
you're redoing the whole editor, but what are your plans for, like, for example, like server side workflows and allowing users to, on Bubble, where I come from, we have
Yeah.
backend workflows, they're called, and we
Yep.
can create workflows that run on the server, right? And
Hmm.
I often, and many other bubblers often, use them to do a whole bunch of stuff behind the scenes that the user doesn't need to be there for client side. What are your thoughts
Hmm.
around that particular area of development? Where are you guys at? What are the conversations happening behind the scenes?
Yeah. So that was actually one of the that's actually something that's currently in our new editor. I mean, it's not live yet, but that's one of the first things we started tackling. Because you're right, it's such an important feature. It actually was. It actually was shipped in our beta editor. Like we have users who use it, but it was we didn't feel like we really nailed the experience enough, and it was causing more confusion than like it was worth. So that was something, right, we like stripped out because we're just like, yeah, we're not ready to you know let even our beta users really experiment with this. Um, but yeah, so our truthfully, it's not much different, right? Like we in our beta editor, we provide a backend section where you can create a workflow, and I would say the big differences there is like uh, in addition to being able to schedule a workflow, one of the things that we felt like was the important was to be able to just like run the workflow like an action and be able to like actually immediately get a result back. And so you can reference the result of that workflow
Mm.
in different steps that you were calling. And we actually use this backend workflow in lots of different places. We allow you to attach a backend workflow directly to a page. So every time the page loads, it will actually run this backend workflow with it. And then that data will just be available on your page as like a source. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff that we make available in backend workflows, as well as there's some kind of nifty stuff that we can do because we, through our like the infrastructure partners that we've partnered with, because we're deployed on so many different servers around the world. We're actually most of the time the code's running so close to our user that if you got their zip code, it's going to be their zip code, their accurate zip code. And so, we provide variables like that on the back end of the line to do some pretty cool stuff in terms of, customizing what your page looks like depending on where your user is in the world, running some analytics on your users. So
That's super cool. A lot of those backend features sound amazing too. I was imagining building with them as you were describing, or as you were talking about some of these features. I love too. One of the things I noticed playing around with Brevity yesterday are like certain decisions
yeah,
that you made around, just around, I guess, like how you again design this interface on the front end. Like I loved the idea. I think you called them utilities.
yeah,
I loved the idea of like setting up my database connections in one spot rather than like building the actual database queries into a bunch of different places on the front end. I set them up right there, and then I can reference them wherever I want to on page,
yeah,
well, throughout the different elements on the page. So there were lots of different. I think I'm going to before this interview drops, I'm going to do a little demo, of course, if it's okay with you, of like some of the
yeah,
stuff that I discovered playing through the Brevity Builder. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, again, this ties into everything that we've been talking about in terms of just like design decisions, development philosophy, and you seem to have tied the database very close to how a Brevity user develops, right? Like you sign up for a Brevity app, you create one, your database is right there, very similar to the way that Bubble works, where I
yeah,
have this database right there. I set up my types, or my tables, let's call them types,
yeah,
Bubble language, but I set up my
yeah,
tables
yeah,
and the
yeah.
different fields that I have, and I get going. So there are other, I think like WeWeb, for example, their approach to this problem was let's just build a front end builder and be
Yeah.
totally agnostic to what the user wants to use for their backend.
Yeah, doing the back
Why
end,
did
yeah.
you, why did you decide to go the route that you did, which seems to be very similar to what Bubble did in terms of coupling those
Yeah,
two together?
yeah, that's a good question. And one preference I'll add is that, in talking about other platforms, I understand how tricky these products are to build, and so, I really do only have, um, but even in Bubble, there will always be a little special place in my heart for Bubble, even as I, try to steal all of their users. Uh, I mean, just because, I feel like they, I've learned so much from them. They do so much for the community. Like, I understand how hard of a problem it is. And so I'm not, we've been talking about things that I think are different or bad or whatever, but, why did we decide to go full database? The answer is that, uh, that was the dream. And then we sort of, there's so much to build. It's like such a massive product that we did start exploring the idea of like, okay, well, like where are some like wedges that we could get into? Maybe we could just do the front end. Maybe we could do, maybe we could just do the back end at first, and then we'll bring like the front end tools later. Um, and we even like tried that. Like we built a version of our editor that didn't really have a whole bunch of database stuff. And we, we have users who are using, are not using Brevity just as a front end tool because Bread's a great front end, and they're just integrating with their API that they, they're companies that have engineers who built this API and they're just integrating with it. Um, but honestly, it just I mean, it goes back to, right, like I think it was uh the vision I had from the beginning that like anything we tried, it just didn't feel right not having it all together. Because I think, and the best way I can describe it is that it's part of what makes building in Brevity so magical. And I would say, yeah, yeah, probably that's part of a lot of people love Bubble as well, is that like uh you have like, the in code world, right? Yeah, you do have a front end, you have a back end, and they tend to be pretty separate. You have to figure out how to integrate them. And there's some cool innovation happening in the code world to make that more seamless. But like that's part of what makes Brevity so magical, is that like you can have a database and you can have a front end, and I can just go in and just say like I want this, and this. Like, and you went through this like some crazy nested like selection process of getting all these joins, whatever, and the user didn't even have to worry about it. Like they just had to select the fields they wanted, and we took care of like all the complexities behind the scene. And so just by managing the backend and the the database and authentication and these backend workflows and the front end and how they all get deployed, there's just so many optimizations and just like I said, maybe for lack of a better word, magic that we can make happen on the platform. Uh, that we just wanted to do. It was just like that was the way that we thought a platform was built. So to be clear, it is optional, right? Like we give you a database, and we've even flirted with the idea of making it something that you go and like you create an app, and then it's an extra step to go and say like, oh well, yeah, let's like add a database to this. So you don't have to use it. Like if you want to use Brevity just to build static, like landing pages or whatever, you could do that, and there's a good chance they're very, very performant, and you know you could do everything that some other landing page builder would do, but just didn't feel right from our our product sense. And we had the resources and we had the ability to sort of get it out the door, so that's what we're doing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, that's another example, I think, too, of a trade off, like the flexibility
Yep.
that you get, let's say, of having your own backend wherever that exists and connecting to it
Yep.
via APIs is just another thing that you have to worry about. And I agree with you. I mean, I think a lot of people love just like creating an app, having everything that you need right there to get a basic CRUD app up and much more.
Yeah. Yep.
So it makes total sense to me. A lot of what we've talked about, a lot of the ideas that you've mentioned in terms of just talking to users and deciding what features to build and what to optimize for. I imagine that notepad of ideas is just massive and seemingly never ending, and all of those
Yeah.
ideas require a lot of resources. And I know that you guys raised 2.75 mil in seed funding. This was, I think, like
Yep.
almost a year ago now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Okay,
correct. I actually don't remember the exact date, but it feels about right.
I'm guessing that you were in college before you got started with all of this. I'm guessing that this is the
Hmm.
first time you've raised a substantial amount of money. What has that process been like for you? What has it been like trying to, I imagine that this problem is probably similar to what any founder has to deal with in terms of like, how do I,
Yep.
now that I have these resources, how do I allocate them? But in
Yep.
particular with this problem that we're talking about, where there is an infinite number of ways that you could go with building this product that you're building out, what
Yep.
has that process been like for you in terms of like deciding what to spend money on and where to allocate these resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely tough, and I'll answer by I love it's like a John Ivey quote of him quoting Steve Jobs, which you may have heard of before, right? Where he basically says like what is focus, um, and I'm paraphrasing, so hopefully I don't like box the quote too long. But he basically says like focus is when every everything you have wants to go and do X, but you choose not to because something else is more important. And so, yeah, it is tough. I think it's been, we've had even though we knew we needed to, it's been, like you have to sort of strengthen the muscle of being able to cut stuff and say no. And, um, like we tend to have a rule that like, if if we're not having to add stuff back in because we cut too much, then we didn't cut enough in the first place. So that's tend to be what we, that tends to be sort of what happens with us is we'll say, okay, we have some idea, like let's ship like we create some idea of how a feature should work. Then we try to just like narrow it down to as simple as it can be. That's the first version that we ship. And then, we get the feedback that says like, well, we actually need this. And then we go and add to it. And so, that works for us. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can think about it, right? Like, I mean, and personally, I would say what helps a lot is to many times just forget that it's there. Like you have the money and it's there. But like, I think there's a lot of value in many ways, like trying to not feel like you have all that cash and, thinking of yourself as more of a bootstrapped company. Like one of the things we did early on was that we actually like, as soon as we had a product that was even like remotely usable, we started taking on clients as like an agency rather than like using the platform, but like in Brevity, employees would build products for people. One, because we needed someone to dog food our product. Like we needed someone to use our product, and so dog fooding it was the best way to do that. And two, it was a great way for us to, make some easy money. And so, we've been able to reduce the amount of money that we've burned by, doing something creative to make money that was related to our product, helped us improve. And, like we're not a agency. Like the life of Brevity is not going to be, someone hiring a Brevity employee to build for them. But we did that early on just for the sake of, wanting to not, waste the money that we had, and it provided a great chance for us to learn a lot about our own product.
So, Merriam-Webster defines brevity as shortness of duration, which makes sense when I think about what you're building and what the no-code space is all about. Are there any other reasons for the name? Why brevity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I won't say who, but you've had them as a podcast guest recently. I'll say that. Told me he didn't like the name very much. So I don't know if it's a great name. Truthfully, it wasn't even my first choice. I was running down, like when I first started, Brevity had a different name, and I just couldn't get a domain for it. I like tried a whole bunch of different combinations, and then I ended up finding one that wasn't even like the actual domain. It was kind of like I think it was like had the word get or something or use in front of it. And so I reached out to them and see if they'd mind selling me the domain, and they said sure for $300,000. And I said for $300,000 I'll change my name. So yeah, I wanted something like the initial idea of I have in my head is that like I wanted Brevity to be 10 times faster, which is kind of ambiguous, but because I wanted it to be that way, right? To be 10 times faster to build on, for the app to be 10 times faster, to be 10 times faster to ship a new feature, to be 10 times, you could grow 10 times faster by using Brevity. And so, yeah, I've been trying to find words that, seem to express that idea of like being short, concise. You are right. Like there's a kind of a concept of, I love about the no-code community that like we're all about like picking a solution that works and not trying to overcomplicate it. So there's like that aspect of and I could get a domain. So
nice.
It worked
That's
out.
always, yeah, for less than $300,000, which is always nice.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a silly question too?
Of course.
Every time I was on Brevity yesterday and I'd go into a loading state, I would see this whale swimming on the screen. Why the big blue whale?
Yeah. Um, so you would ask us that question. That was the reason why. Uh,
Just because.
yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I think there's tiers to how you build a product. There's like tier one. I didn't make this up, but I don't remember where I heard it, and I stole it. So now it's mine. Um, there's like, can you build something? Like the first step is like, can you just like build something quality at all, right? Like, that's step one. Then I would say step two, which like, again, these kind of start conflicting with each other, is like, can you build something quality and can you build it quickly? Uh, and then I would say like the third tier is like, could you build something quality and build it quickly, and does it delight your customer? Which I think sometimes we stop at like quality and sometimes we do it quickly, but like uh, the absolute last thing that I want Brevity to feel like is for it to be like a chore or to feel like
Mm.
just like a tool you use in your job. But like I want using Brevity to feel like almost like a game, like you like love coming back to, and it's like a fun experience, and we'll try to accomplish that through like a beautiful UI and uh, you know our blue whale and random sound effects that we've hidden throughout the app that I'm sure you'll discover soon. Um, and so, that's the reason.
It's a good answer. I was hoping for some like crazy poetic story behind the whale and what it represents. Um,
No,
but
yeah,
but a good answer nonetheless. Okay, last
yeah,
question for you. So, where do you see Brevity in 5 years? What are your ambitions for it? Like, do you see, again, because this kind of circles back to my first question. There are so many
yep,
players in this no code space. Um, different each tackling, you could probably argue a different space. You see some of
yeah,
these
different
mobile
areas or
app
niches. Yep,
builders. That's an obvious one,
yep,
right? Like Flutterflow, Adalo. Where do you see
yeah,
Brevity fitting into that, or how do you see Brevity fitting into this space in, let's say, 5 years time?
yeah. It's a good question. I hope this doesn't not answer your question, but truthfully, like I don't think that you should be ignorant of your competitors, but I don't necessarily think that, uh, at least at our stage, that's who we focus on. And so, like when I think about who Brevity is competing against, I don't necessarily think of the different no code players, and I instead think about programming languages. And so, or, code in general. And so, like I genuinely believe that if we can execute on, our roadmap and all, hit the goals that we want to hit, that like we'll start out, uh, like I'm sure you've seen the like classic disruption curve, from like the innovator's dilemma, where, like right now, sure, many of our early users are going to be building like, from the outside world, it might look like very simple, you might even say like dinky, like little apps, that people would be like, well, that's not very amazing. And that's fine because, we felt like, there's a whole world of ideas that don't get built because hiring someone to write them in code just don't get built. So like, if that's where our initial customer is, that's fine. We're very low on this chart. But, I think over the next 5 years, we'll start to go upstream and we'll be able to prove that like, hey, yeah, this app was very simple, but look how performant it was. And oh, and by the way, like, this little simple app actually grew to be a pretty big app, and look at how well they scaled on our no code platform. And which, we'll start seeing more and more companies adopt it, even the ones who probably have the option to go, hire engineers. And then we'll start seeing, bigger companies start feeling like, hey, we actually have to rebuild this piece of our tech stack, and rather than spending a year building it, let's build it in 3 months in Brevity. And And so yeah, in 5 years, like our mission is to make it that when someone's building software, like it would be the wrong, like it would be the wrong choice to write it with code and not use Brevity to build it, because Brevity is going to be more performant. You can build it faster, and we make it much easier to scale once you actually launch.
Awesome. All right. Well, Ryley, thank you so much for coming onto the pod. You really have a fascinating story, and I wish you all the best with everything that you're working on. It's great to see people who are passionate about solving this problem and about no code in general coming into the space and tackling it in their own way. So thank you so much. Where can people find you online? How can people follow Brevity's progress?
Uh, yeah, so I would say, right now we're doing signups for the access. So you can just go to our, we're just brevity.io is our domain. Follow us on Twitter at Brevity Builder. Um, yeah, I'm on Twitter quite a bit. I don't use it all the time, but occasionally I'll, uh, you know, tweet about some stuff or questions we have about Brevity. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It was really fun. It's great to talk.
Awesome, man. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Yep.
See you in the next episode. Bye bye.
Yep. See ya.